Hello everybody, my name is Tommy and welcome to Aero Workshop. Today I'm going to show you how I fit these doors into this cabinet. Now this video is going to be from the very start of fitting the door to get the door the exact size that I want because it's inset into the frame, and then it'll also be fitting the hinges and getting the doors to hang. When I made the doors for this cabinet, I made them an exact tight fit into the frame. This allows me to have the freedom to have a little bit of material to remove to get the perfect fit that I want on the doors. So to start with, I'm just going to lay the cabinet on its flat on the bench and just lay in the two doors. And then I'm going to show you the system that I use to get the perfect fit on the doors. Okay, with the two doors just laid into place into the cabinet, as you can see they are a tight fit, there is no movement in them. But even if there was a bit of movement, this system will still work. Now, I am going to be hanging these doors on some 2.5-inch brass butt hinges. Now, the hinge itself automatically leaves a gap. Once you fit the hinge, you will have a certain amount of a gap in the hinge. So what I have is little spacers made up just out of some laminate that I've glued up that is an exact fit to the gap in the hinge. So what I want, because I'm going to have that gap on both hinge edges, I want that gap on the top and the bottom and in the middle as well. So to do this, I'm going to be doing the top and the bottom of the door first. And to do that, I'm going to take a tight measurement of the frame. I'm going to set the fence on the panel saw to that exact measurement. And then when I am cutting the door, I'm going to put one spacer in against the fence and cut one end of the door, turn the door around, add another spacer and cut the other end of the door. And that will give me the exact gap that I want at the top and the bottom. And by doing it that way, I will also be removing the same amount of material off the top and the bottom rail of the door so that the rails will still look equal to one another. So that's what I'm going to do first. Okay, with the doors now back in place and the top and bottom cut, as you can see, I can put the shim in to the bottom and I can put one in at the top so that I know that the top and bottom gap is good. The next thing I want to do is start working on the width. So I need to start removing material on the width. Before I do that, I just want to make sure that the doors are square and I don't need to plane a little bit more off one end of the door just to square it up. So to do that, I'm just going to slide it down tight to the rail, and I can see that that is actually sitting perfectly, as is that one there. And it's the same at the top, like that. So now that I know that they're square and I don't need to remove any material off either end of the door, I have my surfacer set up for half the thickness of the shim, which is 0.8 of a millimeter or 0.85 of a millimeter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run 2 passes on the hinge sides of both of the doors. First, I'm going to bring them back, I'm going to check them, and then I can remove one more pass on each side just to get the exact size. Maybe I might only need to remove one pass because the surfacer might not be exactly the right thickness, so I can check that as I go. It's better to check them than be trying to add pieces back on when you're finished. So as you can see, I now have a spacer fitting in on both sides and in the middle. It actually only took 5 passes, not 6, because maybe the thickness is set a little bit heavier than half the thickness of those. So that's the system that I use to get an equal gap very quickly around the door in an inset frame. Okay, with the doors now fitted, we're moving on to fitting the hinges on the doors. Now, for this, I'll be using the hinge jig that I made in a previous video, and if you haven't seen that, I will link it in the description of this video. So I'm just going to show you quickly again how to use this and how to use it when cutting into the frame to keep the gap that we have on the top and the bottom of the door. Okay, with the door now clamped on its edge and the face of the door is actually facing towards me, so that I know that I won't be chopping the hinge into the wrong side of the door, I now get my hinge jig and I hold it dead level with the end of the door, like that, and clamp it in place. Like that. Okay, with my router set up with a top guided straight cutting bit, so the bearing is on top of the cutting edge, I have set the depth of 1 leaf of the hinge, and to do that I just let the bit down until it touches the edge of the door, and I then set the depth stop for the plunge on the router to the thickness of that, so that that just barely fits in there like that. So now I know that that's going to be the correct depth for that hinge. So it's just a case now of routering it out. And with that routed out, all I need to do is get my chisel and take the rounded corners, still using the jig as a reference for the chisel, and just take out the 2 rounded corners. Like that. And now I can remove the jig and offer the hinge into place, like that. And now that is perfectly flush with the edge of the door. The next thing I want to do is actually screw that in place. And to do that, I am going to bore some pilot holes in the hinge using a self-centering bit. So this has a spring-loaded end that reveals the bit, and it'll center in the hole of the hinge. This will stop the screw from pulling the hinge in or out, because it'll be dead center in the hole. So just bore those. And then it's just a case of driving 3 screws. And that's 1 hinge now fitted to the door. So all you have to do is repeat that on the other end, again keeping it level with the very end of the door, and that'll be 1 door finished. So with those now done, I'm just going to go ahead and do the other door, and then we will start to recess the hinges into the frame of the cabinet. Okay, moving on to the cabinet, I also need to chop a hinge at the top and the bottom of each frame. Now, because the unit is actually not on the wall yet, I can actually turn the unit on its edge just to make it a little bit easier to chop the hinges. So doing this is the very same as doing it in the door. You still use the jig in the same way. The only difference is I'm going to use the spacer that we used when we were fitting the doors to lave in at the top of the jig like that, and that will generate the gap that we already had so that the hinge is spaced down the correct distance. So again, it's just a case of clamping that in place and routering it out. And that's that one done. Now, when it comes to the bottom down here, I can't use the jig in the same way because I don't have the space to run the router because of the shelf. So that's where I had said when I made the jig that you can use this in both directions. So when I'm doing this side, I'm going to lay the unit on its flat and I'm going to run from this side with the router with just a slightly longer bearing guided bit. Okay, with the bit now changed to a slightly longer bit that'll reach the whole way down but still leave the bearing running on the jig. It's the very same as before. Put in your spacer at the bottom, keep it down tight and clamp it in place. Like that. And then, again, router it out. Then once again, use the jig to keep the chisel right to tidy out the rounded edges. Just like that. So that's how you can do it. If there's a shelf or something in your way, you can still use the jig to cut a hinge. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other one now, and then we'll hang the doors. So the last thing to do now is just offer the door up to the recesses for the hinge. Like that. Bore a pilot hole. And drive a screw. And now I just need to repeat that for the other one. So with the second door now hanging, as you can see, I have an equal gap across the top, down both sides, the bottom and in the middle. So that's how I fit and hang cabinet doors using a small shim and my hinge cutting jig. So that's where I'm going to leave it for this video. If you liked what you've seen in this video, maybe you consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, maybe you consider subscribing. So all that's left for me to say is thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Good luck.